You've probably been asked already by someone who's a colleague of yours, better qualified than I am, to ask the question. I'm thinking of Tim Morgan. And what would you or should you say if he's around nowadays and sees physics, theoretical and experimental, where it's going? And what would he say? By common life, I mean everything experimental physicists do. Or, well, I guess I should stop my gesturing. You've probably heard a similar question before and answer the one you've heard.
Yeah, so I think one of the good things about thinking of these concepts as sense-based is that they are natural objects which are capable of undergoing development and evolution through time. There's Gary wrote a book a few years ago about Hume's theory of concepts, praising it for making concepts into mental particulars of mind types. And he said, but I don't get very much out of Hume's section on abstract ideas. And since that is Hume's theory of concepts, it's sort of bad if you're you like what Hume says about something, but the section in which he talks about it is one that you don't actually get very much out of. That happened with DC Stokes probability also had used about Hume on probabilities, but the section on probability. Okay, that's preliminary to say it's a good feature that concepts are natural objects which are capable of undergoing evolution in the standard of judgment and in the rules by which to judge them. So Hume is betting, for example, that determinism is the way the world works, that will eventually converge on some set of deterministic principles that will determine everything that's going to happen. But that's just a bet. Right? So those rules could change. The standard could change. The concept of causation might ultimately undergo alterations to the point where it's barely recognizable. But what Hume's betting on is that there's a fundamental mechanism in human nature which accounts for our ability to make causal judgments, and any place that the concept of causation goes after that will be the result of forces in the world operating on that basic mechanism. Likewise, there's room for moral progress in Hume, which is good, right? We had some views that we would now reject, some moral views that we would now reject. Concept of virtue can change, our conception of how to be more sympathetic, or what kinds of considerations to bring to bear, or what the standards should be like. So if it turns out science ends up not utilizing the concept of causation or causal laws, as Russell sort of famously said, I think Hume would say, well, but we wouldn't have gotten to where we got if it hadn't been for the concept of causation. I mean, for the causal sense and the way in which it develops. So I should say, I sort of gestured at the thought that it's not, resistance to global skepticism is not infallibility. And for example, there's the well-known view about color, that when you actually see what the constraints on color concepts are, you see that they couldn't actually be instantiated in the world and that nothing really has any color. That's color skepticism. That's not ruled out a priori. Hume doesn't accept it, but there could be a story according to which the whole set of concepts fall apart. That almost happens with the concept of probability at the end of the treatise, book 1. Probability is rescued by a sort of complicated narrative, later snatched from the jaws of defeat. So I guess that's by way of saying Hume's would be interested and surprised by anything that happens. I also sort of said anything about the distinction between coming up with causal laws and coming up with singular causal judgments. What the cause was in a particular case, what should be described as being the cause in a particular case. There are limits to what he has available to say about that also. One last thing I'll say is, I didn't mention one of the causes for skepticism he finds is the inconceivability of, seeming inconceivable, difficulty in conceiving what the underlying extended nature of bodies is. He accepts that there's a good probable argument that bodies do not have color or tactile qualities, anything resembling the sensations of color we have or the tactile sensations we have. And that means for him that if that's right, then we can't positively conceive of how bodies are extended. That is, what quality fills their extension. There must be some quality that fills their extension. I think his attitude towards that topic is very similar to what his attitude would be towards quantum mechanics, which is, boy, it certainly is confusing what might be going on down there at that level. But I'm sure there are bodies, I'm for sure about that. But that's one of those, so in this case, not a distant high inquiry, but a close and very small inquiry.
Great, thanks. So in a way, this is maybe a follow-up. Maybe I'll use
Okay.
2 fingers. So I wanted to ask you about the individuation of concepts, and particularly the role that the natural correction is supposed to play. So it seems like there's kind of 2 different ways that you can correct the sort of revival set for a concept. Right? So if I realize that I'm subject to like certain kinds of bias or something, right, then I can try to correct the so for causation, like the pairs of events that I actually include in my revival set for cause, right? So I can say, okay, I tend to discount this kind of resemblance, so I'm going to adjust for that, right? And I actually change what ideas I associate with the word cause. But it also seems like there's a sort of further kind of correction, which I can envision, but I can't actually engage in, right? So I can sort of imagine, like, look, if I had more experience, if I could perform certain kinds of experiments, then my revival set would look very different than it does, but I have no idea how to do that, right? And I'm not sure, it seems like that second kind of correction is really important to fixing what the concept of cause is, but it's not clear how you can sort of accommodate that in the sense-based concept, right? Like it seems like it's my actual revival set that determines what concept I have, not this hypothetical revival set that I can't actually form.
Yeah, good. So Hume just talks about the ideas you're disposed to revive. In the book, I have a section about the different distinctions you really need, and Hume really needs, in kinds of revival sets. So even after we've converged on a standard of judgment, still you'll have had different experiences than I've had. And I will have things in my, you said actual revival set, that's the term I use too. The actual revival set is the ideas that I'm actually disposed to revive. And in the normal case, those are things that I actually believe to be causally related. But you've seen things that I've never seen. You're aware of things that I'm not aware of. They're in your revival set, but they're not in mine. So you also need a kind of idealized revival set, which we all aspire to. It's what the revival set that we would have after we made all corrections that we were disposed to make on the basis of the standard being what it is, which in this case is experience sufficiently extensive to not have even representative samples on the topic about which we are judging. So it's partly because we're often disposed to converge on that idealized revival set that it makes sense. That makes sense it does for us to say we have the same concept, even though we are still classifying differently. Right? Having the same concept can't mean that we agree in every judgment we make. Right? We still have disputes about who is virtuous and who is vicious, even if we're agreed about what the general parameters of vice and virtue are. And another distinction he needs is between a sort of regular revival set, which contains just ideas of things that I believe to fall under the concept, and a hypothetical revival set that includes not just the actual ones, but possible ones. And those are what I need for making modal judgments. Right? I can make a judgment not just that all dogs are collies, but that all dogs are necessarily collies, then that's a judgment not just about all the dogs that exist, but about all possible dogs. So many refinements are actually needed on that score. Another question about individuating concepts is whether you should say, you and I have the same concept if we just have the same revival set, even if we typically produce it in different ways. So to draw the distinction between semantically simple concepts and semantically complex concepts, that requires individuating concepts in a sufficiently fine-grained way that the method by which you produce the revival set makes a difference. And then if you want to go even more fine-grained, differences in conceptual role might be thought of as generating a different concept also. So in a way, I think that's all to the good. Concepts are natural objects, so they have varying degrees of resemblance to one another. Not just that my concept is your concept, but your concept and my concept are sufficiently similar that it makes sense to think of them as the same concept if we individuate them this way, but if we individuate them this other way, we
So I guess I'm still not sure what role the idealized revival set is. Like, so it might just be that it's true that in the end we would converge on the same idealized revival set, and it's in virtue of that we have the same concept of cause. But it might also be that somehow we have to represent, right? When I use the concept of cause, I actually sort of in some way represent or gesture at that idealized revival set, even though I can't form it, right? That I actually think that there is some set of things, some set of pairs of events that really are causes and effects. And so if you have to do that in order to have the same concept, that seems like more robust than just saying, well, in the end we would converge on the same set. We actually also think that we would converge on the same set.
Yeah, in fact, what I'd like to say is we suppose that we would converge on the same set.
Okay.
So we don't believe it. That is, we don't formulate the belief at the end of idealized inquiry we will all converge. But in saying that my judgments about something are true and yours are false or vice versa, we are in fact supposing that there is one idealized revival set, which is the revival set that is produced from the standard judgment. Or if we allow some diversity, blameless diversity, then there are some things that are definitely in, and then some things that are definitely out, and then some things about which people are allowed to feel as they want. But if you've got blameless diversity about everything, then people are just expressing their feelings, people are just expressing their reactions. I say ice cream good, you say ice cream bad, but we don't think we're disagreeing with each other. Then we haven't yet generated some standard of judgment. We haven't got some common concept other than the concept of being liked by the person who experiences.
So we have the same concept partly because we suppose that they converge.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that as I described the process, the initial conceptualization is the beginning of there being a shared concept. Each person does initial conceptualization for themselves, but even within themselves, given their different reactions at different times, they will naturally converge on a standard, and we will converge jointly on a standard. One thing I want to emphasize about converging on the standard is that it's not that the concept already has a correct way to judge about it, a correct standard by which to judge of it. And our job is to figure out what that standard is. Rather, we will naturally converge on our standard in the development of the concept, and the standard we converge on helps to determine what that concept actually is. Now, typically, there'll be good reasons of convenience, and it's not an accident that we converge on the general point of view that involves sympathizing with those closest to the person being affected. That's the point, that's the standpoint from which we get the greatest amount of feeling, and hence the standpoint from which we're able to make the finest discriminations. And we like being able to make fine discriminations. But if we converged on something else, that wouldn't have been wrong. That would have been a different concept. It would have been the wrong standard for the concept we have, but it would have been the right standard for some other concept.
Barrett? Oh, no, Barry.
Good.
So my question is about how to reconcile the projectivist, realist, reductionist, and skeptical insights. So some of this actually is helpful, but I'm still not clear on how exactly, particularly to reconcile the reductionism with the skepticism. I dare say skeptical realism. So let me say how I understood it, and then you should correct where I went wrong. So the realism says, just put it in my words, there are truth makers for causal claims, or at least we suppose that there are. But metaphysically speaking, we don't know what they are. Yet, when and only when there is constant conjunction as experienced by an ideal observer, causal claims are true. There is causation. Finally, as a psychological matter of fact, we project a mental quality onto the world. I just don't. So I don't see how you can say all of that. I can see how you could say each one, but
Right. And why do you want to say each one?
Right. But so, in particular, if constant conjunction as experienced by an idealized observer is necessary and sufficient for causation, it seems that there is nothing. How can we be metaphysically skeptical? And well, if we're metaphysically skeptical, then how can the claim by necessity and sufficiency stand? And then, what's the psychological dimension? It seems like that psychological dimension should explain the metaphysics if it's a sense-based concept. Right. So those are the
Okay, so I'll take those be two questions. I'll answer this one over here, and then I'll just stand over here and answer that one. And since this involves realism and reduction, we'll work over here too. So that might help to think in terms of the now partly defunct distinction between the essence of something and its appropriate, translated as properties, but special kind of properties. The idea is the thing has an essence which makes it be the kind of thing it is, and then various properties follow from that essence. They are therefore inseparable from the thing because they follow from the essence. You got the essence, then you got the thing. What Spinoza's example is the essence of a circle is to be a set of points equidistant from the center, and then there are various properties of a circle. These are things that every circle must have, and some of them are things that only circles can have. But they're not the essence of the circle, because they're things that follow from the essence of the circle. So Hume understands that lingo. He has sort of two different approaches to the term essence. Sometimes he says, we never know the essence of things. That's typical for an empiricist who just has an imagination and not like to say, I don't really grasp the essence of the thing. The essence of the mind is unknown, for example, he says. So that's a bodies can be unknown. So there's a sense in which he thinks, essences. We just see qualities of things. We don't grasp this essence, property, structure. And then sometimes he has sort of deflationary usage where he'll say, the pleasure of the sentiment of beauty is the very essence of beauty. That just means sort of everything we call that kind of flows in some way from this particular feature of it. Okay, so the point of introducing that distinction was to say that we know that constant conjunction is necessary and sufficient for causation. But if we're talking about a relation there, which we have picked out by means of the concept of causation, what we know is that we've got something that's necessary and sufficient for it, based on that being what's picked out by the causal sense. We don't know whether that property of constant conjunction is itself follows from some deeper feature. Now, if you ask yourself, well, how could it? I mean, how could there, couldn't there be cases in which there was constant conjunction without this deeper thing? I don't know. Some people think kind of not. There's Ross thinks like, no, you just couldn't possibly explain constant conjunction unless there were some deeper thing. You have to have the deeper thing in order for there to be constant conjunction. So at the metaphysical level, where you're saying you're describing two things that stand in some relation, that involves constant conjunction. Is constant conjunction the end of the story? Is that explanatorily basic? Actually, for us, it is explanatorily basic. But, can we sort of, with some vague relative idea, imagine it's not? Suppose that it's not explanatorily basic? We certainly feel the need to have some further explanation for it. Is that ruled out by the semantics? No, it's not ruled out by the semantics that there is something further also. Another example might say, to be glued, that's a surface structure. But maybe the surface structure is ultimately a property that arises from deeper quantum features which we don't even fully understand. Right? So that, having that surface structure is necessary and sufficient for being glued. But what deeply explains that surface structure is yet something else, which is closer to the essence of glueness than the thing that our sense is picking up on. Right? Okay, so that's kind of trying to say that in the concept, there's room for supposing that there's something more, but that whatever you say about the something more, that's not enough. The uncertainty about that is not enough to break the necessary insufficiency of constant conjunction, which is what Hume wants to emphasize. Okay, so that's the realism and the reductionism. And then the projectivism. So really there are two different respects in which people have said causal judgments for Hume involve a projection of something that's not really there. So one of them is the impression of necessary connection, and the other is this disposition to make causal inferences. So if you think that something is being projected in causal ascriptions, you might think it's being projected in such an essential way to the meaning that it renders all such judgments false. Once you realize that what's being projected is something that's not really there in the world, then that means that all the judgments were false because it was part of the semantics that there had to be this thing which now it turns out is not there. So with respect to the impression of necessary connection, I'm saying, oh, this can be projected, even though it's not really there. Something resembling your impression of necessary connection, not really a feature of the bodies. Hume loves it when some cognitive error nevertheless makes it possible for you to have some kind of cognitive success that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have. So the belief that there is an external world of bodies depends on conflations and confusions, but it all turns out well in the end. You believe that there are bodies, which you wouldn't be able to do unless you made these confusions and conflations. So the causal sense, you could probably get yourself a concept, some kind of concept of causation like concept, without projecting the impression of necessary connection. But there's just things that produce this internal sensation. But the fact that you spread them onto the objects makes the pairs seem more similar to each other intrinsically than they otherwise would seem similar to each other intrinsically. So it seems like the pairs all have this impression of necessary connection as qualities of them. So that makes it easier to develop a concept of causation. Great. We made an error. The error helps you develop this concept. And then that's separate from the question of whether your causal judgments are vitiated by this projection. At the end of the second inquiry, he talks about us building and staining, in the case of virtue, building and staining external objects, people's characters, with internal sentiments. Some people think that as a suggestion we sort of also project moral sentiments onto the individuals themselves. If so, and maybe that helps us form the concept. It doesn't vitiate the judgments that we make, though, that we engage in that projection. Okay, so there is a projection as part of the psychology, right? There's part of the psychology that there is some projection onto the world of something that's really all in the mind. But it doesn't prevent there being true causal judgments. It doesn't even prevent unclear supposition that there's something more besides constant conjunction to causal judgments. And then the more recent quasi-realist idea that what we're projecting is not the impression of necessary connection, but a disposition to causalize. Yeah, we are expressing that also. It's part of the conceptual role of the concept of causation, that when you judge that A causes B, you no longer scruple to foretell B on the basis of A. We do express that, but that doesn't prevent, again, certain causal judgments from being true if they fall within the scope of the standard of judgment for causation. So the Blackburn suggests that being quasi-realist, you can call causal judgments true. What? You should call them true. That doesn't mean that they deeply represent anything about the world. That means that that judgment corresponds to our normative standards for looking at causal inferences. I think, so although it's true that Hume's happy to grant that you are expressing that causal inference making disposition when you judge things to be related to cause and effect, and it would be paradoxical if you said, A is the cause of B, but I'm not willing to infer B on the basis of A. How did that work? Why is it in your concept of causation if you're not willing to make that inference on the basis of it? I just don't think that's Hume's way of thinking about truth. Hume has a very straightforward correspondence notion of truth. An idea is true if it represents the idea corresponds to the way things actually are. So I just don't think Hume has that sophisticated conception of yeah.
You make it quick, we have 6 more people on the queue in 20 minutes. So.
Okay.
But you do.
I do want to follow up to the first part. So you say, so if I can sum up the way I've understood it, you say there's conceptual space for metaphysical essence of causation that's over and above constant conjunction.
Yeah. And barely metaphysical space, because it's only by way of a relative idea, but you're not sure. But captures the coherent possibility.
So we suppose there is.
Yeah, we suppose there is.
So does this mean that on your view, what we suppose is not subject to the copy principle? So we can suppose things that we can't think.
Yes. So in 2 different ways. So supposing something involves acting as though it's always true. In the notion of something's being true, I guess there's some sort of ideas involved. But for example, I can suppose that 2 + 2 is not 4. I can't conceive it. I can't form a clear conception of it. But I could do some things that would follow from certain things about, that now 2 + 3 is 5. I would then engage in certain operations. I would have certain columns in some ways, and somebody might say, well, you're supposing that 2 + 2 is 4 when you have columns that way. So yes, you can suppose to do that. And also relative ideas, which is another way of supposing something, allows you to suppose the existence of something for which you can't form a positive idea, and in that sense, it gets you. You still have to use some ideas in order to have the relative idea, but those are subject to the copy principle.
Yeah.
So you're supposing that we have a causal sense, but
I'm supposing it. Yes, I'm acting as though I believe this for sure. Yeah.
as far as I know, Hume never uses that locution, right?
That's right.
And he never, in the passage about probability, he says all probable reasoning is nothing but a species of sensation, which could be interpreted a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Although he also talks a lot about sentiment and culture.
But it seems that, so I'm unclear on whether what you're saying is that that senses are sense-based concepts, but in order to be a sense, like the sense of wit or the moral sense, there might be something additional needed, like a unique kind of content or disjunct from other sorts of senses.
Yeah, I said a distinctive mental response. Yeah.
A distinctive response. So I'm unclear whether you're saying those are senses, whereas cause is a sense-based concept. And, those are senses and sense-based concepts. Cause is a sense-based concept, but it may not have that whatever the additional properties are that make it a sense. Or if you're saying cause is a sense in just the same way, wit and the moral sense are senses. And even if he goes out of his way to say that they have additional features, they have features like delicacy, and he characterizes the qualitative experience of them, and he uses that to distinguish it from other senses. Cause is still a sense in, that sense. Does that make sense?
Okay, so
I was wondering if you'd give me a dual definition again.
yeah, no, right. So I am saying that with Hutchison, you see a proliferation of kinds of senses, which in Hutchison just involves the distinctive mental response. That we're going to develop a sense-based concept around it, I think is more evident in Hutchison. So I'm not saying that there are sense-based concepts without senses that underlie them. I'm saying that even though Hume didn't specifically use the term causal sense or sense of probability, everything else he says about them suggests that there is something that you could call the causal sense, and that's what I tried to identify as the characteristic mental response. So in the causal case, I said it was two-part. It was the impression, necessary connection felt while getting to what is also felt, the sentiment of belief in the conclusion. And in the case of the sense of probability, it's the liveliness of the belief itself, which doesn't have to result from probable reasoning of probability about memory and the senses too, I take it high degrees of. So the ability to feel an idea with degrees of liveliness is the sense of probability from which the concept of probability arises. And then the bit that I didn't suggest is that the concept of probable truth, that is the probability of a belief's being true, is one of those indirect sense-based concepts. So we're just talking about probability. Probability applies to possible matters of fact. That it will range 9, that's probable. That's not to praise it in any way or to criticize it. It's just not saying something good or bad about that possible state of affairs. I'm just saying it's probable. But I think the primary normative notions in epistemology, the primary epistemically normative concepts for Hume are truth, falsehood, and probable truth, probable falsehood of beliefs specifically. So that's what you can say about a belief that will be taken in a good sense, is to say that it is probably true. So that there's a sense-based origin to the probability of truth. Not truth itself. Truth itself is not a sense-based concept. There's no sense of truth. That's just correspondence with reality. But probability of a belief being true, that is judged by sense, and that has a lot of implications for epistemic normativity that parallel those that we got for moral and even aesthetic normativity.
Between steps 2 and 3 in the development of causation, do you have to have at the level of the real observer, as opposed to the ideal observer, absolute constant conjunction between things? Because I'm thinking of Aristotle couldn't find any except in the heavens, and he postulated a fifth essence because it was so different. Why? Because universal laws apply up there, but no, down here it's all nature. His phrase is nature is only for the most part. So would Hume directly contradict Aristotle and point out examples? Or would he say, well, we're just using different definitions, different concepts? Well, you get the idea, because the objection to Hume, of course, is that he makes propter hoc post hoc, and the usual answer that I heard is, well, but he makes it absolutely universal, not just mostly universal. But then going back to the not the ideal observer, but to the real observer, how do we, if we don't see absolute conjunction, how do we ever get the concept of causation?
Okay, so one of the, thank you for that question. So one of the corollaries of the four definitions, which I alluded to very briefly, is that there are not degrees of necessity. And what he's trying to resist there is the move with respect to freedom of the will, that there's physical necessity and then moral necessity, that these are two kinds of necessity, one of which incompatible with responsibility and the other compatible with responsibility. But what he says is there are not two degrees of necessity, because either you've got enough constant conjunction to generate the inference, or in which case you got necessity, or there's not enough constant conjunction. The conjunction is not constant enough to be that way. The conjunction is not constant enough to generate the inference, in which case there is no necessity. He doesn't actually stick to that, no degrees of necessity, when he's talking about what everyone agrees about physical determinism. He talks about the highest degree of necessity. But what that passage reveals, the corollary reveals, is constant conjunction doesn't have to be interpreted as absolutely uniform constant conjunction. Just constant enough to generate the inference. And indeed, the inference can come with different degrees of confidence in the conclusion, which is part of the reason why he doesn't really stick to the no degrees claim. Okay, so in principle, just needs to be constant enough. He thinks that there are people who recognize causes, but don't think that they're entirely uniform. Not just Aristotle, but also the vulgar, who, noting that a watch ceases to run, comment, well, sometimes causes fail of their usual effects. And the vulgar response is, there's just a little bit of, indeterminism in the world. Usually causes operate, but sometimes they just sort of take a holiday and some other cause operates instead. Now, there's some other cause why the hands don't move if the cause that usually moves the hands is not operating. But he says, but philosophers, post-Aristotelians, in the new mechanist world order, we all think that universal determinism is going to be true. That's not analytic from the concept of causation. That's a discovery. It's a rule for judging of causes and effects, not part of the meaning of the term cause. It's a rule for judging of causes and effects. Could be reversible. Could turn out that that's how things looked for a while, and then, no, sorry. But he is betting on universal determinism, and that helps him in various ways, but it's not built in. I guess you could say it could eventually become part of the concept of causation if accepting those rules became part of the qualities of an observer that constituted it.
Do you think that's sufficient so that he's not making propter hoc post hoc?
I think that's... Yeah, I mean, I guess he's saying, he is saying enough post hoc, enough of one thing after another is enough to make the one thing be the cause of the other. But that doesn't mean there's not still room for diagnosing a fallacy of that kind. You thought that was a fallacy. That's not a fallacy, it's just scientific procedure. The causal sense operates on a broad range of experience. Reid famously objected that according to Hume, day should be the cause of night and night should be the cause of day, because each follows the other. With any of these concepts, you're not stuck with your first reaction. You're allowed to read rules and reflection on the other things you know. And presumably Hume's response to night and day is twofold. One, it's a rule of causal relations that the complete cause must immediately have its effect. But day is around for a long time before you ever get night, and then night exists for a long time before you ever get day. So can't be the whole cause, have to be at most a part of the cause. But also, since Copernicus, we've got a better conception of what the actual causes of night and day are that are much more well integrated into a much bigger pattern of constant conjunction than just this day-night case. And those causal generalizations subsume the unexplained way of explaining the night-day correlation as one of the instances of it. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, sorry.
So I wanted to ask you a question about occasionalism. You said about occasionalism here. So you said that there's this corollary of the impossibility of constant conjunction without causation, that this was against occasionalism. But it's not exactly that occasionalists think there's no causation.
No,
it's just that it's not where we thought it was.
That's right.
So,
the power is not located.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering then, what's Hume's real concern about occasionalism? Sorry, to put on my glasses. Is it that it's, so what is it? Is it that it's committed to some notion of power? That's the problem? Or is it that it's a kind of agent causation as opposed to, so it's a concept of causation that's, because it's volitional, it's sort of agent causation, and this is not a sense-based concept? So what's the real worry about occasionalism?
Yeah, good. I think what that question indicates is that you're a little fast and loose about occasionalism in the corollary, where the structure is, having given you these definitions, I'm going to show you how many wonderful philosophical consequences follow from them. One is, people have had all these different distinctions of causes, formal causes and final causes and occasional causes, and there's only efficient causes. There's no other kind of cause. Why? Because if you got constant conjunction, you've got an efficient cause. If you don't have constant conjunction, you don't have any kind of cause. Right? So, end of story. So there can't be occasional causes, meaning by that things that are causes but not really causes, because you won't have constant conjunction as a result of the agency of something else. Basically what he's saying is whoever, occasionalists, they should just concede that the things that they're calling occasional causes, they're just real causes, they're just efficient causes. You can't make out this distinction that these things are constantly conjoined, even though there's not really a causal relation between them. Now, having said that, that runs slightly afoul of the previous response, because maybe my overall theory is the best explainer, best causal rule is divine volitions then are constantly conjoined with the things that occur in the actual world. He's just sort of deeply unsympathetic to that. He's unsympathetic to it in the sort of way that he's also sympathetic to the idea that maybe religious miracles aren't violations of the laws of nature after all, because the real law of nature is whatever God says happens, and then other things are just sort of general. That may have to do with a kind of sort of sense-based conservatism about things. That is, my sense is just irresistible. I'm thinking of these things as causes. I'm thinking of, in the dialogues, he talks about compositions that violate the rules of art, and yet everybody agrees they're great. Then it's the rules of art that have to give way, because we're just holding on to this. I just hold on to the fact that these things are, one billiard ball moves another billiard ball. You can tell me stuff about God and His volition. I never observed any of those. I don't believe in any of those. Okay, so, but elsewhere, he does show, carefully, elsewhere when he's discussing necessary connection, he shows a good understanding of what Volbranch's occasionalism actually was. There he's more heaping abuse on the idea that we don't perceive any necessary connection in interactions in the world, but nevertheless we understand necessary connection from the case of God's being the cause of all things, as in Volbranch. Say, well, that's an unexpected circuit, but somehow you'd be able to get the idea of necessary connection from something you never experienced, God's volition. And anyway, I think with Volbranch occasionally we're gotten into fairyland long before the end of the story. But you're right, that was a kind of quick and dirty way of handling occasionalism. I felt a little twinge just putting occasionalism on the slide there, but the point I wanted to convey was, constant conjunction, not subsumed under some later constant conjunction, so that the causal sense does give us an ultimate verdict. This falls under the concept of causation.
Sure.
I found this four developmental stages very useful, especially for a non-Jung scholar who forget about the last two stages and almost takes the first and second and mushes them together. I'm interested in them with regard to something that's been discussed directly and indirectly, this idea of taking in a good sense. I'm thinking of Jung's philosophical personality as with a great sympathy for the vulgar and suspicion of the philosophical genius, but on the other hand, having a strong desire to correct vulgar error. Comes out clearly in the dialogues about foolish bumpkins believe all these goofy things. I'm wondering to what extent something like Strawson's sense that it's incoherent that they're just constant conjunctions. It's a necessary truth that there is something in virtue of which the impressions we have are constantly, things are constantly conjoined, and that's taking it in a good sense. That's taking causality in a good sense. And that you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm wondering what you would say to that, and perhaps what he would say to a more science fiction-y, what if everyone was Strawsonian? What if it were an uncorrectable intuition that, this is terrific stuff, but for some reason I'm not convinced, and I remain convinced that it's in virtue of some power in the cause that the effect occurs. How does he deal with those two?
Right, okay, so you're talking about being a Galen Strawsonian, not a Peter Strawsonian. So the first question, what would Hume say if he read Strawson? I think his response would be, I deeply understand why you want to say that, look, there has to be some explanation for all this constant conjunction. It would just be some kind of miracle if all these things were constantly conjoined and yet there were no secret powers in virtue of which they were constantly conjoined. I can psychoanalyze that for you if you'd like. I can explain exactly why you feel that way. But I think the most analogous case for Hume is the case in the dialogues where, in response to the cosmological argument, that you have an infinite series of causes and effects. The idea is still there must be some other cause of there having been that entire sequence of causes and effects. And it's Cleanthes, but Cleanthes is speaking for Philo, I think it's speaking for Hume, when he says, look, if you got 20 of something, you explain each of the 20, you don't also have to give an additional cause of the whole 20. Likewise, if everything in this sequence is an effect that has an explanation and prior cause, you don't also have to explain the entire sequence. And similarly, we explain individual things that happen by subsuming them under causal laws, which means hopefully recognizing them as instances of greater regularities. That's pretty much what explaining, insofar as we understand what explaining is, does. And so the cause of the explanation for why A followed B and the next A also followed B and the next A followed B is that A's always followed B. A's are the cause of B. Now you're asking me to explain why A's are the cause of B. I can understand that as subsuming it under some more general law of nature. But I don't recognize a kind of explanation that is the explaining of laws of nature by appeal to something other than laws of nature. That's not the psychological mechanism explanation, even though I understand why you feel that way, because, I'm sorry to have to say this, it's because you're conflating causal necessity with demonstrative necessity, but so that's the answer to the first part. The answer to the second part, what if everybody was just unremittingly Strawsonian about this and said, yeah, I followed that. Followed what you said there, but I got to tell you, the degree of force and vivacity that's attached to my imperfect, unclear, relative idea is just irresistible. Then I do think that the doctrine I just enunciated about the sense of probability and how to treat irregular arguments means that that's not criticizable. I mean, we just say, so, yes, that's probable. That thing we don't know what it means exactly, or whether it's even possible. We don't know whether it's even possible, but it's probable. But also, I think, you don't think anything very much practical turns on the answer to that question. But this, deep at the bottom of this is, how resistible is this? And Jennifer will talk about this too. This is connected to the most violent paradox. It says the most violent paradox in the treatise. And I read that section as saying, but you can kind of get over this, right? But, you know, it's Hume saying, if you think about this life, you can kind of get over this. Right? So maybe there are two kinds of people, you know, the philosophical realists and the philosophical reductionists, and they just have to learn how to be friends, like Philo and Cleanthes.
I think in the interest of time, we should thank our speaker. And